The poor black teen who saved an old man from a fire thought he was a hero. But when a black SUV filled the street the next morning, his mother's face went pale at what the wealthy family accused them of. Marcus Johnson's pencil tapped against his chemistry textbook as he stared at the molecular equations. The desk lamp cast a yellow glow across his scattered notes, the only light in his second-floor bedroom besides the street lamp outside. His phone displayed 9:42 p.m., and he still had 3 chapters to review before tomorrow's test. "You got this," he muttered, running his hand over his close-cropped hair. "Just focus." A car door slammed outside. Marcus glanced through his window, overlooking the quiet Cleveland street below. His mom's usual parking spot remained empty. A hospital shift wouldn't end for another hour. The sound came from Mr. Peterson's driveway. The old man shuffled from his car to his front door, grocery bags in hand. Marcus watched him fumble with his keys, nearly dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. Should probably check on him, Marcus said to himself, but the practice problems demanded his attention. He'd already missed 2 shifts this week for study sessions, and they couldn't afford any more lost income. His phone buzzed. A text from his mom. "Hours cut again next week. We'll talk when I get home." Marcus's stomach tightened. He grabbed his calculator, punching in numbers, not chemistry equations, but their monthly budget. Rent, utilities, groceries. The gardening jobs barely covered the gap as it was. Movement caught his eye again. Mr. Peterson had left his front door wide open, the grocery bags abandoned on the porch. Through the window, Marcus saw him wandering his living room, looking confused. "Come on, Mr. P," Marcus whispered. "Just get your groceries inside." He'd noticed these moments more frequently lately, Mr. Peterson standing in his yard, staring at nothing, or walking to his mailbox multiple times a day. The neighbors whispered about it, but nobody did anything. They all had their own problems. Marcus turned back to his textbook. Electron configurations. Atomic orbitals. The words blurred together as his mind drifted to the gardening job he was supposed to have tomorrow. Mrs. Rodriguez needed her hedges trimmed, and that was an easy $50. A flicker of orange drew his attention back to the window. At first, he thought it was just the reflection of the streetlight, but something was different about Mr. Peterson's kitchen window. A strange haze seemed to be gathering behind the glass. Marcus pressed his face against his own window, squinting. The haze grew thicker, darker. His heart rate picked up as he realized what he was seeing. Smoke. No, no, no. He jumped up from his desk, knocking his textbook to the floor. The smoke was definitely coming from inside Mr. Peterson's house, and it was getting darker by the second. Marcus grabbed his phone and ran to his bedroom door, then stopped. Should he call 911 first? But what if Mr. Peterson was stuck inside? How long would it take the fire department to arrive? Through his window, he saw an orange glow joining the smoke. Fire. Screw it. He shoved his phone in his pocket and bolted from his room, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Their apartment was only on the 2nd floor, but it felt like climbing down a skyscraper. He burst out of the building's front door into the cool night air. The smoke was visible now from the street, curling out from under Mr. Peterson's eaves. Marcus sprinted across the patchy lawn separating the buildings. The front door was still open, but thick smoke poured out like a dark waterfall. "Mr. Peterson," he shouted from the bottom of the porch steps. "Are you in there?" No response, just the growing crackle of flames from inside. Marcus pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth. The groceries still sat on the porch where Mr. Peterson had left them, milk, bread, cans rolling loose from a torn paper bag. He heard coughing from inside. "Mr. Peterson." The smoke stung his eyes as he reached the doorway. Heat pushed against him like a physical wall. Through the haze, he could make out the shape of furniture, family photos on the walls, the old TV Mr. Peterson always watched his game shows on. More coughing, followed by a confused voice. "Martha? Is that you?" Martha was Mr. Peterson's late wife. Marcus had seen her photo on the mantel dozens of times while doing yard work. The smoke was getting thicker. Marcus's eyes watered, and his lungs burned even through his shirt. He could barely see 3 feet in front of him. A neighbor's voice called from the street, "Oh my God. Somebody call 911. Marcus took a deep breath of relatively clean air from outside. The heat was intense now, and he could hear the distinct whoosh of flames from deeper in the house. Mr. Peterson called out again, his voice weaker. "Martha." Marcus stepped through the doorway into hell. The familiar layout of the house he'd visited so many times was now a maze of smoke and shadow. He dropped into a crouch, remembering something about smoke rising. The air was slightly clearer near the floor. "Mr. Peterson, it's Marcus. Where are you?" A crash from the kitchen made him jump. Orange flames licked up the walls, spreading across the ceiling. The heat pressed against his exposed skin like hot metal. Another weak cough guided him toward the kitchen. He crawled forward, using the wall as a guide. The wallpaper was hot under his palm. The kitchen doorway glowed orange. Through the smoke, Marcus could finally see Mr. Peterson. The old man sat on the floor near the stove, his back against the cabinets. His usually pristine blue button-down was covered in soot. "Mr. Peterson," Marcus scrambled toward him. "We have to get out." Mr. Peterson looked up with unfocused eyes. "The soup. I was making soup for Martha." The stove was the clear source of the fire. Flames roared up from a pot of oil, spreading across the ceiling in a growing web of orange and black. Marcus reached Mr. Peterson and grabbed his arm. "Come on. We have to go now." "But Martha, she'd want you to get out. Please." Something in Marcus's voice must have reached him. Mr. Peterson nodded weakly and tried to stand. His legs shook, and he nearly fell. Marcus wedged himself under the old man's arm, taking his weight. The smoke was so thick now he could barely see the doorway. His lungs screamed for clean air. They stumbled together through the living room. Mr. Peterson's weight nearly dragged them both down twice. The heat was unbearable. Marcus felt his exposed skin blistering. After what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, cool air hit his face. They were at the front door, just 3 steps down to safety. A loud crack from above made Marcus look up. Part of the porch roof was sagging, glowing orange at the edges. "Almost there," he wheezed, half carrying Mr. Peterson down the steps. His muscles trembled with the effort. They made it to the grass as the porch roof collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks and burning wood. Neighbors rushed forward to help. Someone took Mr. Peterson's other side. Marcus heard sirens in the distance. His vision swam. His lungs felt like they were filled with acid. The last thing he saw before passing out was Mr. Peterson's face, lit by the flames consuming his home, mouth moving in silent words as tears cut clean trails through the soot on his cheeks. Marcus woke to the taste of smoke and ash. An oxygen mask covered his face, the elastic band tight against his cheeks. Red and blue lights flashed across neighboring houses, casting strange shadows on familiar walls. "Is coming around," a voice said above him. A paramedic leaned into view, her face illuminated by the emergency lights. "Can you hear me?" Marcus tried to sit up on the stretcher, but firm hands held him down. "Take it easy," the paramedic said. "You inhaled a lot of smoke." "Mr. Peterson." His voice came out raspy, barely audible through the mask. "The elderly gentleman? He's okay. Being treated in the other ambulance." Marcus turned his head. Through the chaos of emergency vehicles and gathering neighbors, he could see another ambulance. Mr. Peterson sat on its back step, also wearing an oxygen mask. A different paramedic checked his vitals. "Your arms have some burns," the paramedic said, drawing Marcus's attention back. "Second degree, but not too severe. We need to get you to the hospital for—" "No hospital," Marcus interrupted, pulling the mask away. "Can't afford it." "Son, you need—" I said no. He sat up despite her protests, ignoring the wave of dizziness. "Just patch me up here." The paramedic frowned but didn't argue. She'd probably heard it before in this neighborhood. "At least let me treat those burns. And keep the mask on a few more minutes." Marcus nodded, replacing the mask. The cool oxygen helped clear his head. As the paramedic cleaned and bandaged his arms, he watched firefighters battle the blaze that used to be Mr. Peterson's house. Flames still poured from the windows and roof. Water from multiple hoses seemed to have no effect. The heat reached him even from 30 feet away. "Marcus!" He turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez pushing through the crowd of onlookers. She was still wearing her waitress uniform from the diner. "Oh, thank God," she said, reaching the stretcher. "I saw the flames from my window. When they brought you out." She wiped her eyes. "I called your mother at the hospital. She's on her way." Marcus's stomach dropped. His mom would have to leave work early. More lost income. The paramedic finished bandaging his arms. "Keep these clean and dry. Change the dressings daily. And seriously consider going to the hospital if you develop any breathing problems." Marcus nodded. but his attention was on Mr. Peterson. The old man stared at his burning home, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I need to check on him." Marcus stood, swaying slightly. "You need to rest," the paramedic insisted. But Marcus was already walking toward the other ambulance, each step steadier than the last. The crowd parted for him, voices whispering, "That's the boy who ran right into the fire. Could have died." Mr. Peterson looked up as Marcus approached. Tears had cut clean tracks through the soot on his face. "Marcus." His voice trembled. "My house. Martha's things." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, sitting beside him. "I should have checked on you earlier when I saw. You saved my life." Mr. Peterson grabbed Marcus's hand, squeezing with surprising strength. "I was so confused. The oil caught fire, and I couldn't remember what to do. I kept thinking Martha would know." A firefighter approached them, helmet under his arm. "Mr. Peterson, we contained the fire, but I'm sorry. The interior damage is extensive." Mr. Peterson's grip tightened on Marcus's hand. "The kitchen was the point of origin," the firefighter continued. "Looks like an oil fire that spread to the cabinets. These old houses go up fast once they catch. You're lucky this young man saw the smoke when he did." Lucky? Marcus didn't feel lucky. His arms throbbed where the flames had kissed them. His throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. And Mr. Peterson had lost everything. "Marcus." He turned to see his mother running toward them, still in her nurse's scrubs. Her face was tight with worry. "Baby, what were you thinking?" She reached them, hands immediately checking his injuries. "Running into a burning building." "Mom, I'm okay." "You're not okay. Look at these burns." She turned to the paramedic. "Why isn't he at the hospital?" "He refused transport." "Of course he did." She touched the bandages gently. "Just like your father. Always playing the hero." "I'm fine," Marcus insisted. "Really?" A commotion near the police line drew their attention. A news van had arrived, a reporter and cameraman setting up equipment. "Oh no," Marcus's mother muttered. The reporter, a well-dressed woman with perfect hair, headed straight for them. The cameraman trailed behind, lens already focused on Marcus. "Excuse me," the reporter said, microphone ready. "We heard a young man risked his life to save an elderly neighbor. Could we get a statement?" "No comment," Marcus's mother said firmly. But Mr. Peterson spoke up. "This boy is a hero. I'd be dead if not for him." The reporter's eyes lit up. The camera moved closer. "Please," Marcus's mother stepped between them and her son. "He's injured and tired. No interviews. Just a few questions." I said no. Marcus was grateful for his mother's interference. His head spun, exhaustion settling into his bones. The adrenaline that had carried him into the fire was long gone, leaving only pain and fatigue. "At least let us get some footage," the reporter pressed. "This is a wonderful human interest story. Local teen saves elderly neighbor. People need to hear about things like this." "What people need," Marcus's mother said, "is to let my son rest." More emergency vehicles arrived. Police interviewed witnesses. Firefighters continued their work. Through it all, Marcus sat with Mr. Peterson, watching decades of memories burn. "My wedding album was in there," Mr. Peterson said quietly. "All our photos. Martha's favorite chair. Her garden club awards." His voice broke. "Everything." Marcus didn't know what to say. No words could replace what the flames had taken. The fire chief approached, removing his heavy coat. "Building's not structurally sound. You'll need to find somewhere else to stay, Mr. Peterson." "Do you have family we can call?" "His children," Marcus said. "But they haven't visited in 3 years," Mr. Peterson finished. "Not since Martha's funeral. They're all busy with their own lives." The chief nodded sympathetically. "Is there a number we can reach them at?" "They need to be notified." Mr. Peterson recited a phone number in a hollow voice. The chief wrote it down and walked away, already dialing. Dawn was breaking by the time the fire was fully extinguished. The house that had stood for over 50 years was now a blackened shell. Water from the fire hoses ran down the street in dark rivers. Marcus's mother insisted they go home. His arms needed cleaning and fresh bandages. But as they helped Mr. Peterson to his feet, the old man looked lost. "Where will I go?" "You'll stay with us," Marcus's mother said without hesitation. "We have a fold-out couch." "I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition." "Marcus, help Mr. Peterson to our apartment while I get his prescriptions from the paramedics." They walked slowly across the lawn. Mr. Peterson stopped at his driveway, looking back at the ruin of his home. "I met Martha right there," he said, pointing to the burned porch. 52 years ago. She was new to the neighborhood, asking for directions. I was washing my car and made a fool of myself trying to impress her." He wiped his eyes. "She always said it was my nervous stuttering that made her fall in love with me." Marcus supported the old man's weight as they climbed the stairs to his family's apartment. Each step seemed to age Mr. Peterson another year. "Thank you, Marcus," he said as they reached the door. "Not just for the fire. For listening. For caring. There aren't many who do anymore." Marcus helped him to the couch, finding spare blankets in the closet. By the time his mother arrived with the prescriptions, Mr. Peterson was asleep, his face finally peaceful. But Marcus couldn't rest. Despite his exhaustion, despite the pain in his arms, he stood at his bedroom window. Smoke still rose from Mr. Peterson's house, a thin gray line against the brightening sky. Something about that smoke, about the way it twisted and disappeared into nothing, felt like a warning. The morning news van arrived before Marcus could finish his cereal. Through the apartment window, he watched the reporter from last night set up for a live broadcast, a cameraman framing the shot with Mr. Peterson's burned house in the background. "Don't answer if they knock," his mother said, changing the bandages on his arms. The burns looked worse in daylight, angry red blisters covering both forearms. Mr. Peterson still slept on their fold-out couch, snoring softly. He'd barely moved since collapsing there 5 hours ago. Marcus's phone buzzed. Another message from his boss at the garden center. "Saw the news. Take the week off to heal. Job's waiting when you're ready." "Great," Marcus muttered. "A week without pay." His mother read the message over his shoulder. "We'll figure something out." "How?" "You just got hours cut at the hospital, and now I can't work." He gestured at his arms. "Bills are due next week. We've been through worse." She finished taping the fresh bandage. "Your father and I had nothing when we started out, and now he's got nothing again, wherever he is." His mother's hands stilled. "That's not fair. Neither is any of this." A knock at the door interrupted them. Through the peephole, they saw the reporter, microphone ready. "Please," she called through the door. "Just a few questions. People should know about what happened here." Marcus's mother pointed at his room. He nodded, retreating quietly as she cracked open the door. "My son is resting," she said firmly. "But the community wants to. Goodbye." The door clicked shut. Marcus sat at his desk, wincing as his burned arms touched the wood. His chemistry textbook still lay open from last night, the test he'd been studying for completely forgotten. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Mrs. Rodriguez. "Tell your mother not to worry about rent this month. Consider it payment for keeping our favorite neighbor alive." Something tight in Marcus's chest loosened slightly. Mrs. Rodriguez owned a small apartment building, running it with her late husband's insurance money. She'd always been kind to them. But this? "Marcus." Mr. Peterson's voice came from the living room. "Is someone at the door?" Marcus found the old man sitting up on the fold-out, looking disoriented. "Just reporters," Marcus said. "Mom scared them off." "Reporters?" Mr. Peterson squinted at him. "Why would—" His face fell as memory returned. "Oh, the fire. Yeah, my house. Everything's gone, isn't it? I didn't dream that part." "I'm sorry, Mr. Peterson." The old man nodded slowly. "Call me George. After what you did, I think we're past last names." Marcus's mother emerged from the kitchen with coffee and toast. "Eat something, George. You need your strength." "Thank you, Claire." He took the coffee with shaking hands. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "Nothing to repay. We take care of our own around here." A commotion outside drew them to the window. More news vans had arrived. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, some giving interviews, others just gawking at the burned house. "Vultures," Marcus's mother muttered. Mr. Peterson stared at the remains of his home. "I should call my children. They'll want to know." "The fire department already contacted them last night," Marcus said. "Oh, right." He sipped his coffee. "I suppose they're too busy to come." "They usually are." As if on cue, a sleek black SUV turned onto their street, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. It moved slowly past the news vans, past the neighbors, finally stopping directly in front of the burned house. Mr. Peterson's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. The SUV's doors opened. A well-dressed man emerged from the driver's side, tall, gray-haired, carrying an expensive briefcase. From the passenger side came a younger woman in a business suit, her heels clicking on the pavement as she surveyed the damage. "Richard and Sarah," Mr. Peterson whispered. "My children." Marcus watched the siblings approach the police tape surrounding the property. Their father's house lay in ruins before them, but their faces showed no emotion. Richard spoke to a firefighter, gesturing at the building. Sarah pulled out her phone, typing rapidly. "I should go down," Mr. Peterson said, trying to stand. "They'll want to know what happened." Marcus's mother steadied him. "Let me help you get cleaned up first." "Marcus, find him a clean shirt." But before they could move, heavy footsteps sounded on the exterior stairs. A sharp knock followed. Through the door. "Dad? Are you in there?" Mr. Peterson smoothed his soot-stained clothes. "Come in, Richard." The door opened. Richard and Sarah entered, bringing the smell of expensive perfume and leather into the small apartment. Their eyes swept the modest space before landing on their father. "My God," Sarah said. "Look at you." "I'm fine," Mr. Peterson assured them. "Thanks to Marcus here." The siblings turned their attention to Marcus. He resisted the urge to hide his bandaged arms. "You're the one who pulled him out?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir." "And you live here? In this building?" Something in his tone made Marcus's jaw tighten. "Yes, sir." Sarah was already on her phone again. "I've found an excellent facility in Connecticut, Dad. Private rooms, full-time care. We can have you transferred by the end of the week." "Facility?" Mr. Peterson's voice shook. "What are you talking about?" "A nursing home," Richard said. "This settles it. You can't live alone anymore." "I'm not going to a nursing home." "Dad, be reasonable. You nearly burned to death. If this boy hadn't happened to see the fire." "His name is Marcus." "Fine. If Marcus hadn't been there, you'd be dead. Just like you could have died a dozen other ways, living alone in that house. The stove, the stairs, the medications you can never remember to take." "I managed just fine." Sarah finally looked up from her phone. "Really? Is that why we got a call at midnight saying you'd set your house on fire?" "It was an accident. Exactly our point." Richard set his briefcase down. "We've been worried about this for years. Now we have no choice. The house is destroyed, and you need proper care." Marcus watched Mr. Peterson shrink into himself, becoming smaller with each word from his children. "I have friends here," the old man said quietly. "A life. You'll make new friends at the facility. Better ones. People your own age." Marcus's mother stepped forward. "Maybe this isn't the best time for this discussion." "He's still in shock." Sarah gave her a dismissive look. "And you are?" "Claire Johnson, Marcus's mother, and a registered nurse." "Well, Claire, with all due respect, this is a family matter." "A family matter?" Marcus couldn't stay quiet any longer. Where was family when he needed help with yard work? Or someone to check on him? Or just company after Mrs. Peterson died? "Marcus," his mother warned. But he continued, "We're not the ones who abandoned him. We're not the ones who—" "Abandoned?" Richard's face reddened. "How dare you? We paid his bills, maintained his insurance, managed his finances. What have you done except watch him deteriorate from your window?" "I saved his life. After letting him get into danger in the first place. If someone had been there, had been watching him properly, that's enough." Mr. Peterson's quiet voice cut through the argument. "All of you?" The room fell silent. "I'm tired," the old man said. "I've lost my home, my memories, everything Martha and I built together. And now I have to listen to my children and the boy who saved my life fight over what's best for me." He stood shakily. "I need some air." "Dad, wait." Sarah reached for him, but Mr. Peterson was already walking to the door. He opened it, then paused. "You know what Martha would say about all this?" He didn't turn around. "She'd say we're all being stupid. And she'd be right." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Marcus moved to follow, but his mother caught his arm. "Let him have a moment." Through the window, they watched Mr. Peterson descend the stairs slowly. News cameras turned to follow him as he walked to the police tape surrounding his ruined home. He stood there, one hand resting on the barrier, staring at the blackened walls that had contained his life. In the apartment, no one spoke. The silence stretched until Sarah's phone buzzed, making them all jump. She checked the screen. "The insurance adjuster will be here this afternoon. All business again. We'll need to inventory what's salvageable, get the cleanup process started. The sooner we can get the property on the market." "You're going to sell it?" Marcus asked. Obviously. What else would we do with a burnt-out house? Marcus looked at his mother, then at the window where Mr. Peterson stood alone. The black SUV gleamed in the morning sun, a harbinger of changes none of them could stop. The insurance adjuster wore a gray suit that matched the ashes in Mr. Peterson's yard. He walked through the burned house with a tablet, taking photos and making notes while Richard and Sarah followed close behind. Marcus watched from his window, arms throbbing beneath fresh bandages. Mr. Peterson sat in Marcus's mother's worn armchair, staring at his hands. The facility in Connecticut has an opening, Sarah said, pacing the small living room with her phone. They can take you next Tuesday. I haven't agreed to go, Mr. Peterson replied quietly. Richard's voice carried up from the yard. Where's the deed? We'll need it for the sale. Filing cabinet in the study, Sarah called back through the window. If it survived. Marcus's mother entered with coffee for everyone. Her nursing shoes squeaked on the linoleum. She'd picked up an extra shift to cover their lost income. George, she said, handing Mr. Peterson a mug. Have you considered other options? There are assisted living facilities right here in Cleveland. Sarah's heels clicked as she turned. We've researched extensively. The Connecticut facility is top-rated. It's also 6 states away from his home and community. A community that let him nearly burn to death. Marcus stood up. That's not fair. I check on him all the time. More than his own children's. Sarah's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. Is that what you were going to say? Sarah. Mr. Peterson's voice cracked. Please. Richard came up the stairs, insurance adjuster behind him. His expensive shoes were covered in ash. Preliminary estimate is in, he announced. The structure's a total loss. Foundation might be salvageable, but it would cost more to rebuild than the property's worth. The adjuster nodded. Given the age of the house and the extent of the damage, I recommend taking the full payout and selling the lot. Mr. Peterson's hands tightened around his coffee mug. My garden. Martha's roses. Dad, Sarah said. Be practical. This is for the best. You'll have a fresh start. At $90,000 a year, Marcus muttered. Everyone turned to look at him. What did you say? Richard demanded. I looked up that facility's website. $90,000 a year. Plus fees. Marcus met Richard's gaze. That's what his fresh start costs. And how is that any of your business? It's my business because I care about what happens to him. Because I've been here, helping him, while you were too busy to visit for 3 years. Sarah stepped between them. We maintained that house. Paid the taxes. Managed his retirement accounts. Don't you dare imply we don't care. Caring isn't just writing checks. Marcus. His mother's warning tone. But he couldn't stop. You want to ship him off to die in some fancy prison because it's convenient for you. Because actually being here, actually helping him day to day, might mess up your perfect lives. Richard's face reddened. You have no idea what you're talking about. No idea what it's like trying to manage an elderly parent's care from. From where? Your big house in Boston? Your beach place in the Hamptons? Marcus's voice rose. Must be hard, making those tough decisions from your vacation home. That's enough. Mr. Peterson stood suddenly, coffee cup falling to the floor. It shattered, dark liquid seeping into the carpet. The room went silent except for the drip of coffee and the distant sound of cameras clicking outside. I'm not a child, Mr. Peterson said. His voice shook, but his eyes were clear. I'm not a problem to be solved. I'm not a burden to be shipped away. I'm your father. Sarah reached for him. Dad, we're just trying to help? By taking me away from everything I know? Everything your mother and I built? The house is gone, Dad, Richard said softly. There's nothing left to stay for. Nothing left. Mr. Peterson looked at Marcus and his mother. These people took me in without hesitation. Marcus risked his life for me. Claire's working extra shifts just to cover the cost of helping me. That's nothing. The insurance adjuster cleared his throat awkwardly. I can come back another time. No one acknowledged him. What happens when they can't help anymore? Sarah asked. When Marcus goes to college. When Claire gets tired of having an extra person in her tiny apartment. We won't get tired, Marcus's mother said firmly. That's not how community works. Richard laughed sharply. Community? Is that what you call this? Living in a rundown apartment. Working multiple jobs just to scrape by. Better than living in a golden cage. Marcus shot back. Stop it. Mr. Peterson's voice cracked. All of you, just stop. He walked to the window, looking down at his ruined home. The news vans were still there, vultures waiting for their story. Your mother, he said quietly, would be ashamed of all of us right now. The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's phone buzzed, making everyone jump. She checked it, then said, "The facility needs an answer by tomorrow. They have a waiting list." Mr. Peterson didn't turn from the window. "Do you remember when you were little, Sarah? You used to help your mother in her garden. She taught you all the flower names in Latin. Dad. And Richard, you built that treehouse in the backyard. Took you all summer. It wasn't much, but you were so proud." "That was a long time ago," Richard said softly. "Yes, it was." Mr. Peterson finally turned to face his children. "Everything that made that house a home, everything your mother touched, everything we built together, it's all ash now. But my life isn't over." "No one's saying it is," Sarah began. "Aren't you? Shipping me off to Connecticut, selling the property, erasing every trace of our family's life here." He shook his head. "Your mother would never have allowed it." "Mom's gone," Richard said sharply. Then, softer, "She's gone, Dad. And we have to deal with what's left. What's left is me. And I'm telling you, I won't go." Sarah's phone buzzed again. She silenced it without looking. "What's your plan then?" Richard asked. "Live in this apartment forever? Burden these people who barely know you?" "He's not a burden," Marcus's mother said. "And we know him better than you think." The insurance adjuster cleared his throat again. "I really should get going." "Wait," Mr. Peterson said. "Before you go, what's the actual damage assessment? Not just the summary." The adjuster consulted his tablet. "Main floor is a total loss. Second floor has severe smoke damage but some structural integrity. Foundation solid. Back portion of the house, including the garden area, sustained minimal damage. With proper permits and contractors, rehabilitation is possible but would exceed current market value by approximately 40%. So it could be rebuilt." "Dad?" "No," Sarah said. "The cost. The insurance payout," Mr. Peterson continued, ignoring her. "How much?" The adjuster named a figure that made Marcus's eyes widen. "That's more than enough for the Connecticut facility," Richard said quickly. "It's also enough to rebuild." Mr. Peterson's voice strengthened. "With money left over for modifications. Safety features. Whatever you think I need." Sarah shook her head. "Dad, be reasonable. Even if you rebuild, you can't live alone. What happens next time you forget something on the stove? Next time you get confused?" "He wouldn't be alone," Marcus said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" Richard demanded. Marcus met Mr. Peterson's eyes, saw the hope there. "I could help. I already do yard work for half the neighborhood. I could check on him daily, help with meals, make sure everything's safe." "You're a child?" Sarah scoffed. "I'm 16. Old enough to work. Old enough to save someone's life." He gestured at his bandaged arms, "Old enough to make my own choices." Mr. Peterson smiled for the first time since the fire. "The boy's right. And is not alone. This community, the one you dismiss so easily, they look out for me. Mrs. Rodriguez brings me dinner twice a week. The Garcia kids help with my garden. Claire checks my medications." "It's not the same as professional care," Richard insisted. "No, it's better, because it comes with love, not a $90,000 price tag." The room fell silent again. Outside, a news van finally packed up and drove away, tired of waiting for a story that wouldn't come. "I won't go to Connecticut," Mr. Peterson said firmly. "This is my home. These are my people. If you want to help, help me rebuild. If not..." He took a deep breath. "Then thank you for your concern. But I'll manage without it." Sarah's phone buzzed a third time. She stared at it, then slowly pressed the power button, turning it off. "Dad," she said softly, "are you sure about this?" "More sure than I've been since your mother died." Richard ran a hand through his gray hair, looking suddenly tired. "The contractors alone will eat up most of the insurance money. Then I'll take out a loan," Mr. Peterson said. "Or sell some of your mother's jewelry. She'd understand." "You won't have to," Marcus's mother spoke up. "I know people. Good workers who owe me favors. We can get it done for less." The insurance adjuster, forgotten in the corner, quietly slipped out the door. Richard and Sarah exchanged looks, years of carefully laid plans crumbling before them. "If you're determined to do this," Richard finally said, "we'll need to discuss conditions." Marcus couldn't sleep. His arms throbbed beneath the bandages, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames. The clock on his phone showed 3:17 a.m. Down the hall, he heard Mr. Peterson coughing. The fold-out couch creaked as the old man shifted, trying to get comfortable in an unfamiliar bed. Marcus sat up, wincing as his burns scraped against the sheets. Through his window, the burned shell of Mr. Peterson's house was a darker shadow against the night sky. His phone lit up with a text from his mother, taking double shift at hospital. Check bandages in morning. Love you. More lost sleep for her. More strain. Their careful budget was already stretched thin before the fire. Now, the floor creaked outside his door. Soft footsteps headed toward the kitchen. Marcus found Mr. Peterson at the sink, filling a glass of water with shaking hands. Can't sleep either? Marcus asked. Mr. Peterson startled, nearly dropping the glass. Sorry. Didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. Burns keeping me up. Let me see them. Marcus held out his arms. Mr. Peterson set down his water and gently unwrapped the bandages. The burns looked angry in the dim kitchen light. Red blisters stretched from wrist to elbow. I did this to you, Mr. Peterson said quietly. You didn't do anything. It was an accident. I forgot about the stove. I've been forgetting lots of things lately. He rewrapped Marcus's arms with careful movements. Richard and Sarah aren't entirely wrong about that. Doesn't mean they are right about shipping you off to Connecticut. Maybe. But look what my forgetfulness cost you. He gestured at the burns. Cost your mother, working extra shifts. Mrs. Rodriguez, giving up rent money. We'll manage. You shouldn't have to. Mr. Peterson's voice caught. All those things Richard said, about being a burden, about needing proper care. Maybe he's right. Stop. Marcus grabbed the old man's arm. You're not going anywhere. Marcus, no. Listen. My dad walked out on us when I was 10. Just disappeared one day. No goodbye. No explanation. Left my mom with bills and a kid and nothing else. Marcus's voice shook. You want to know why we help you? Why this whole neighborhood looks out for each other? Because we know what it's like to be abandoned. To have family turn their backs when things get hard. Mr. Peterson stared at him. So yeah, money's tight. Yeah, mom's working extra shifts. But we do it because that's what real family does. Marcus let go of his arm. In your family now, whether your kids like it or not. Silence filled the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off briefly, then quieted. Your father, Mr. Peterson finally said, was a fool. Yeah, he was. But you. The old man's eyes glistened. You're a better man at 16 than he ever was. Marcus looked away, embarrassed. His burns itched beneath the fresh bandages. I have something to show you, Mr. Peterson said suddenly. In what's left of my house. Will you come with me? Now. It's the middle of the night. Best time. No cameras, no insurance people. No well-meaning children telling me what's best. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. They slipped out of the apartment quietly, descending the stairs in darkness. The street was empty except for a stray cat picking through scattered debris. Police tape still surrounded the house, fluttering in the night breeze. Mr. Peterson ducked under it, moving with surprising sureness for a man his age. Careful, Marcus warned. Floor might not be stable. They entered through the front door, which hung crooked on its hinges. The smell of smoke and wet ash filled the air. Their flashlight beams caught swirling dust motes. The living room was a horror show of burned furniture and water damage. Family photos hung crooked on blackened walls, their images warped by heat and fire hoses. Mr. Peterson moved deeper into the house, stepping carefully around fallen beams. Marcus followed, trying not to think about the creaking sounds beneath their feet. They reached what used to be Mr. Peterson's study. A heavy wooden desk stood against one wall, scarred but largely intact. The filing cabinet Sarah mentioned earlier lay on its side, drawers splayed open. Mr. Peterson went straight to the desk. The bottom drawer stuck, but he knew the trick, hitting it just right until it opened with a grinding sound. Here, he said, pulling out a thick envelope. Martha made me promise to keep this safe. He handed it to Marcus. Inside were stock certificates, bonds, and a bank book showing a healthy savings account. I don't understand. Insurance will cover rebuilding the house. But this. Mr. Peterson tapped the envelope. This is for you. For college. For helping your mother with bills. for being the kind of person who runs into a burning building to save a forgetful old man. Marcus tried to hand it back. I can't take this. You can and you will. Martha and I never had grandchildren. She always said we should leave something to someone who deserved it. He smiled sadly. I think she'd approve of my choice. But your kids have more money than they know what to do with. Richard's a corporate lawyer. Sarah runs her own consulting firm. They don't need this. He closed Marcus's fingers around the envelope. You do. Emotions warred in Marcus's chest. Gratitude, guilt, relief, fear. I don't know what to say. Say you'll still help me rebuild. Say you'll still check on me and make sure I don't burn down the new house. Mr. Peterson's voice turned serious. Say you'll use this to build a future your father couldn't imagine. Marcus looked down at the envelope, then at his bandaged arms, then at the burned walls around them. In the distance, sirens wailed, another crisis, another night when someone's world changed forever. I promise, he said. Mr. Peterson nodded, satisfied. Good. Now let's get out of here before that floor decides to finish collapsing. They picked their way back through the ruins. At the front door, Mr. Peterson paused, running his hand along the scorched frame. 52 years, he said softly. Martha and I built a life in these walls. Raised our children here. Grew old here. He turned to Marcus. But maybe it's time for something new. Something better. Outside, the night was lifting. Pre-dawn light painted the sky in shades of gray and purple. The stray cat watched them from its perch on a burned fence post. Richard and Sarah arrive at 9 to discuss conditions. Mr. Peterson said as they walked back to the apartment. Should be an interesting conversation. Want me there? Absolutely. After all, he patted the pocket where Marcus had stored the envelope. Your family now, whether they like it or not. They climbed the stairs slowly, each lost in thought. At the apartment door, Mr. Peterson stopped. Thank you, he said. Not just for the fire. For reminding me what real family means. Marcus's arms throbbed beneath their bandages. His mother would be home soon, exhausted from another double shift. Bills still needed paying, decisions still needed making. But something had shifted, like the first light of dawn breaking through smoke. That's what heroes do, Marcus said, smiling slightly. Or so I've heard. The conditions meeting started at exactly 9 a.m. Richard brought contracts. Sarah brought her laptop. Mr. Peterson brought Marcus. This is a family discussion, Richard said when Marcus sat down at their small kitchen table. He stays, Mr. Peterson replied firmly. Or I leave. Marcus's mother worked quietly in the background, making coffee no one would drink. Her scrubs were wrinkled from her double shift, dark circles under her eyes. Fine. Richard opened his briefcase. Let's discuss terms. The contracts were thick, pages of legal language about supervised care, safety protocols, and financial oversight. As Richard read through them, Marcus noticed Mr. Peterson's hands trembling beneath the table. Daily check-ins, Sarah read from her laptop. Professional monitoring system. Monthly health evaluations. Approved list of caretakers. And who approves them? Marcus asked. We do, of course, Richard answered without looking up. Of course, Marcus muttered. Mr. Peterson spoke quietly. And if I don't sign? Sarah's fingers stopped typing. Richard's papers rustled as he set them down. Then we can test your competency, Richard said, and make medical decisions on your behalf. The room went silent. Even Marcus's mother stopped pretending to clean the kitchen. You do that? Mr. Peterson's voice shook. Your own father. To keep you safe? Yes. Richard's tone softened slightly. Dad, we're not the enemies here. We're trying to help. By threatening me? By protecting you. From yourself if necessary. Marcus stood up so quickly his chair scraped the linoleum. I need some air. No one stopped him as he left the apartment. He went straight to Mr. Peterson's yard, ducking under the police tape. The morning sun illuminated the damage better than their midnight flashlights had. Broken windows, scorched walls, water damage everywhere. But the foundation was solid. The back garden, mostly untouched. Martha's roses still bloomed against the fence, defiant against the destruction. Marcus pulled out his phone. First call. Mrs. Rodriguez? Remember when you said you wanted to help? I need some names. Contractors who work cheap but good. Second call. Hey, Miguel. Your dad still do electrical work? I got a job for him if he's interested. Third call. Mr. Chen? Your brother's a building inspector, right? Can I buy you coffee? Need some advice? By the time he finished his calls, his bandaged arms ached from holding the phone. But he had what he needed: names, numbers, promises of help. He found an old notebook in his backpack, started making lists. Materials, labor, costs. His hand cramped as he wrote, but he didn't stop. What are you doing? He looked up to see Sarah watching him from the sidewalk. Her designer shoes were already dusty from the ash. Making plans, he said. For what? Fixing this. He gestured at the house. Your dad's staying. Might as well make it work. She crossed under the police tape, careful not to snag her suit. You really care about him, don't you? More than some people. She flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she looked at his notebook. Those are contractors. People who help each other around here. Do good work for fair prices. And you trust them, more than some lawyers. That got a small smile. You don't like us very much, do you? I don't like anyone who abandons family. Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking at the house. We didn't abandon him. We just got busy. Had your own lives. Couldn't make time. Marcus flipped his notebook shut. Yeah, I've heard it all before. It's not that simple. Nothing is. But you still make choices. A car door slammed. Richard emerged from the black SUV, more contracts in hand. Sarah, he called. Dad's ready to discuss terms. She hesitated, then turned to Marcus. Show me your plans. The real ones, not just scribbles in a notebook. Marcus studied her face, looking for the trap. Found none. Give me 24 hours, he said. I'll show you exactly how we can make this work. She nodded slowly. 24 hours. But make it good. Richard won't be easy to convince. I pulled your father out of a burning building. Everything else is easy after that. She almost smiled again, then walked back to her brother. Marcus watched them into the apartment, then pulled out his phone one more time. Mrs. Rodriguez, get everyone together. Community meeting in your diner. 1 hour. Yeah, it's about Mr. Peterson. Time to show his kids what family really means. The diner was packed by 10:30. Mrs. Rodriguez's cook worked the grill while people crowded into booths and around tables. Marcus saw familiar faces everywhere. Miguel's father, the electrician, still in his work clothes. Mr. Chen and his building inspector brother, sharing coffee and making notes. Mrs. Garcia and her teenage sons, who helped with yard work. Even Marcus's mother had come straight from her shift, scrubs and all. Marcus stood at the front, his notebook open. Here's what we know. House needs major work, but the bones are good. Foundation solid. Back sections mostly intact. He pointed to his lists. We've got skills in this room. Electricians, plumbers, general contractors. People who know how to build things right. Heads nodded. Phones came out. Calculators clicking. Insurance money covers materials, Marcus continued. But labor's where they'll bleed us dry. Unless we help, Mr. Chen's brother finished. Community rates. After hours. Weekend work. More nods. More calculations. My boys can help with cleanup, Mrs. Garcia offered. No charge. I'll handle permits, the building inspector said. Keep it all legal but expedited. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up. George Peterson's eaten at my diner every Sunday for 20 years. Never missed his wife's birthday, even after she passed. Always had time to listen, to help, to care. She looked around the room. Time we returned the favor. Phones buzzed. Text messages flew. Networks activated. People who knew people who could help. Marcus's mother touched his bandaged arm gently. You did good, baby. Not done yet. He checked his watch. Richard and Sarah want plans? Let's give them something lawyers can't argue with. The next few hours were a blur. Numbers crunched. Drawings made. Permits researched. Every person in that diner contributed something. Knowledge, skills, connections. By the time Marcus walked back to his apartment, his notebook was full and his case was solid. The sun was setting, painting the burned house in shades of orange and gold. Inside, he found Richard and Sarah still at the kitchen table, surrounded by their papers. Mr. Peterson sat in the armchair, looking tired. Here, Marcus said, dropping his notebook on top of their contracts. Real plans. Real numbers. Real people ready to help. Richard frowned. What is this? Community rates for labor. Pre-approved permits. Material costs at wholesale. Marcus tapped the pages. Everything up to code, everything legal. Just without the corporate markup. Sarah picked up the notebook, flipping through pages of calculations and signatures. Her eyebrows rose. These numbers, she started, are solid. Check them yourself. Call the contractors. Verify the permits. Marcus looked at Mr. Peterson. We can do this. Better than before. Safer than before. And keep you right where you belong. Richard shook his head. It's not just about money. It's about proper care, supervision. Got that covered too. Marcus pulled out his phone, showed them the group chat. Whole neighborhoods involved. Check-ins, maintenance, regular visits. Plus safety upgrades Mrs. Rodriguez's son-in-law can install at cost. He does corporate security for a living. Mr. Peterson sat forward in his chair. You did all this today. People want to help. Real people, not facilities 6 states away. Marcus met Richard's eyes. Your father's not alone here. Never was. Sarah was still reading through the notebook. These contractors, they are all local, and licensed, and bonded, and willing to work weekends to get it done faster. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Amazing what people will do for someone they actually know. Richard started to speak, but Sarah cut him off. Let me see those permits. She spent the next hour calling numbers, verifying licenses, double-checking costs. Richard read through the construction plans, frowning but not objecting. Finally, Sarah set down her phone. It could work. Sarah, Richard started. No, look at these numbers. Look at these plans. They're good. Richard, better than good. She turned to their father. And you'd have constant support. Real people checking on you, not just cameras and alert systems. I'd have family, Mr. Peterson said quietly. Just not the kind you expected. Richard stared out the window at the burned house. The sun had set, but streetlights illuminated the damage. And the potential. If we agree to this, he said slowly, there would still need to be conditions. Safety protocols. Regular updates. Done, Marcus said. Mrs. Rodriguez already volunteered to coordinate. She can send you daily reports. And medical oversight. Marcus's mother spoke up from the kitchen. I'm a registered nurse. Remember? I can handle that part. Richard looked at his father. This is really what you want? To stay here? Rebuild? This is where your mother lived, Mr. Peterson said simply. Where she died. Where people still remember her name and tend her roses. He smiled at Marcus. Where a 16-year-old boy risked his life to save a forgetful old man. Sarah closed her laptop. I'll redraft the contracts. Something simpler, focused on safety and communication rather than control. Sarah. Richard protested. Is our father, Richard. Maybe it's time we tried something new. She looked at Marcus. Something better. The tension in the room eased slightly, like smoke finally clearing after a fire. 24 hours, Sarah said to Marcus. You promised good plans. You delivered. Marcus shrugged, then winced as his burns reminded him they weren't healed. That's what family does. The makeshift construction office was a fold-out table in Mrs. Rodriguez's diner. Blueprints covered the surface, weighted down by coffee cups and half-eaten plates of eggs. Marcus sat with Sarah, reviewing safety upgrades for the 3rd time that morning. Motion sensors in every room, he pointed to the drawings. Connected directly to your phones and the local monitoring service. Sarah made notes on her tablet. And the stove. Automatic shut-off after 30 minutes. Plus heat sensors that'll kill the gas if they detect anything abnormal. He turned the blueprint. Miguel's dad added backup power for all safety systems even if electricity goes out. Everything keeps running. She nodded slowly. It's thorough. That surprise you? Honestly? Yes. She set down her tablet. When you first showed us those notebook scribbles, I thought it was just a kid's fantasy. The diner's bell chimed. Richard entered, his suit collecting curious looks from the regular breakfast crowd. He slid into the booth beside his sister. Construction permits cleared, he announced, though his tone suggested he was still looking for problems, assuming inspections pass. They'll pass, Marcus said. Mr. Chen's brother doesn't cut corners. About that. Richard leaned forward. These connections of yours, they're all legitimate? No under-the-table deals. Before Marcus could respond, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with fresh coffee. My diner's been here 30 years, Mr. Peterson. You think I'd risk my business license helping shady contractors? Richard had the grace to look embarrassed. I didn't mean. Yes, you did. She filled their cups. But I understand. You're worried about your father. So let me tell you about these people you're so concerned about. She pointed to Miguel's father at the counter. Tony there? Licensed electrician, 25 years. Does work for half the buildings downtown. Mr. Chen's brother? City building inspector. Most thorough one they've got. My own son-in-law designs security systems for banks. She set down the coffee pot. We're not criminals or cowboys. We're professionals who care about your father enough to work nights and weekends making his home safe. Richard studied his coffee. Sarah hid a smile behind her tablet. Now, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, you want today's special, or are you too fancy for diner food? Special's fine, Sarah said quickly. Thank you. After she left, Richard spread out his own papers. The revised agreement. Simplified, like you asked. But there are still non-negotiable items. Marcus read through the pages. Daily check-ins. Weekly health monitoring. Monthly reports. Emergency protocols. This part, he pointed to a paragraph. About approved visitors. That won't work. Dad needs to be protected from what? His neighbors? The people rebuilding his house. Marcus shook his head. You can have your reports and monitoring. But you don't get to decide who he spends time with. Sarah touched her brother's arm. He's right, Richard. We can't isolate Dad just to make ourselves feel better. Feel better. Richard's voice rose slightly. This isn't about feeling better. It's about preventing another accident. Another fire. Another night when we get called saying our father almost died because no one was watching him. I was watching, Marcus said quietly. What? I was watching. Every day. From my window, on the street, doing his yard work. Marcus met Richard's eyes. Just because you didn't see it doesn't mean no one was caring for him. The diner had gone quiet. Regulars pretending not to listen while catching every word. Richard opened his mouth to argue. But Sarah spoke first, his right again. Sarah. No, listen. She turned to face her brother fully. We've been trying to solve this like lawyers. Contracts, conditions, controlled access. But maybe that's the wrong approach. There has to be structure, Richard insisted. Accountability. There is. Marcus pulled out his phone, showed them the community group chat. Every day, someone checks on him. Mrs. Rodriguez at breakfast. Mrs. Garcia when she brings lunch. Me doing yard work. Mom checking his medications. He scrolled through messages. Everyone reports in. Everyone communicates. If something's wrong, 20 people know within minutes. But it's not professional, Richard said, though his voice held less certainty. No, Sarah said thoughtfully. It's better. It's people who know Dad, who care about him as a person, not a responsibility. Mrs. Rodriguez returned with plates of eggs and bacon. Your father, she said as she served them, was here the day my husband died. Sat with me for hours. Wouldn't leave until he was sure I'd be okay. She straightened, looked Richard in the eye. So you write your contracts, make your conditions. But understand something. We're not accepting oversight from people who couldn't make time to visit their father for 3 years. She walked away before Richard could respond. The diner's usual breakfast chatter resumed, though many eyes still watched their booth. Sarah broke the tension. She makes excellent eggs. Richard picked at his food. You really think this can work? This community care system. It already works, Marcus said. Has for years. We're just making it official now. He pulled out the construction timeline. House will be ready in 8 weeks. Faster if weather holds. Every safety feature you asked for, plus some you didn't think of. Daily reports, medical oversight, emergency protocols, all handled by people who live 10 minutes away, not 6 states. And you? Richard asked. What's your role in all this? Same as always. Check on him. Help with the yard. Make sure he's okay. Marcus paused. Just with better backup now. Sarah finished her eggs, dabbed her mouth with a napkin. I've seen worse proposals from professional care companies. Sarah. I mean it. Richard. Look at these plans. Look at this network they've built. It's not what we imagined, but... She glanced around the diner, at the people pretending not to watch them. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers spread across the table. Finally, he said, the security system stays. Non-negotiable. Already in the plans, Marcus agreed. and daily reports. Medical checks. Emergency protocols. All covered. And if anything seems wrong, you'll know before the coffee gets cold, Mrs. Rodriguez called from behind the counter. Richard almost smiled. Almost. I'll need to modify these agreements, he said, gathering his papers. Add some of these community provisions. Take your time, Marcus said. We'll be here. Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt. 8 weeks. Maybe less. She nodded, then hesitated. Thank you for caring about him. When we should have. Marcus thought about the envelope in his desk drawer, about Mr. Peterson's words that night in the burned house, about real family and choices made. Just don't make us regret trusting you, he said. Same to you, Richard replied, but the hostility had faded from his voice. They left cash on the table, enough to cover 10 breakfasts. Mrs. Rodriguez would probably try to return it. They'd probably never know she used it to buy school supplies for Mrs. Garcia's kids instead. Marcus gathered the blueprints, careful not to get egg on them. Through the diner's window, he watched the Peterson siblings walk to their expensive car. They are trying, Mrs. Rodriguez said, refilling his cup. In their own way. Yeah. He looked at the construction plans, the safety features, the carefully structured support system. Guess we all are. The diner's bell chimed again. Mr. Chen's brother arrived with more permit paperwork. Tony the electrician had questions about wiring. Mrs. Garcia wanted to coordinate the cleaning schedule. Marcus made room at the booth, pulled out his notes. There was work to do. Family to protect. The new safety system chirped as Marcus entered Mr. Peterson's partially rebuilt house. Motion sensors tracked his movement, sending silent alerts to phones in 3 different states. Richard's latest non-negotiable addition to the renovation. Just me, Mr. P, he called out, though the security panel had already recognized his code. In the kitchen, Mr. Peterson replied. And I told you, it's George. The kitchen was a wonder of modern safety features disguised as normal appliances. Auto shut-off stove, heat sensors, gas detectors, all feeding data to a monitoring service 24 hours a day. Mr. Peterson stood at the new counter, frowning at a tablet screen. This video chat thing? Sarah wants to test it. Says it's part of the daily check-in protocol. Marcus set down his tool bag. Hey, let me show you. The tablet was another concession to Richard and Sarah, loaded with safety apps, medical reminders, and direct video links to family and emergency services. Mr. Peterson treated it like it might explode. See? Just tap this green button. Marcus demonstrated. Sarah's contact is right here. Too many buttons. But Mr. Peterson watched carefully as Marcus showed him again. The house around them was a maze of old and new. Original hardwood floors now housed hidden pressure sensors. Classic crown molding concealed emergency lighting. Every inch designed to protect without imprisoning. Sarah's face appeared on the tablet. Dad? Can you hear me? Loud and clear. Mr. Peterson still spoke too loudly, like the tablet was hard of hearing. Marcus is showing me how all this technology works. Good morning, Marcus. Sarah looked different on screen, more relaxed. Maybe. Less lawyer, more daughter. How's the renovation coming? Marcus turned the tablet to show the kitchen. Cabinets are in. Appliances all connected. Tony's finishing the electrical today. And the monitoring systems. Everything works. He didn't mention disabling the bathroom sensors. Some privacy was worth the argument. Your security company signed off yesterday. Sarah nodded, satisfied. Richard wants photos of the... A crash from outside interrupted her. Marcus set down the tablet and hurried to the back door. Mrs. Garcia's youngest son stood in the garden, surrounded by broken pots. Sorry. The wheelbarrow tipped. Manuel Garcia. His mother appeared from behind a rose bush. What did I tell you about being careful? It's fine, Marcus called out. Those pots were cracked anyway. Sarah's voice came from the tablet. What's happening? Marcus returned to the kitchen. Garden crews here. Salvaging what they can of Mrs. Peterson's plants before winter hits. Martha's roses, Mr. Peterson said softly. They survived the fire. Wouldn't be right to lose them to frost. Something in his voice made Sarah go quiet. Outside, Mrs. Garcia directed her sons in rapid Spanish. The roses would be carefully transplanted to a temporary greenhouse at the community center, tended by volunteers until spring. The garden was her favorite place, Mr. Peterson told the tablet. She spent every morning out there, talking to her flowers. Said they were better listeners than people. Sarah's eyes glistened. I remember. She taught me all their names when I was little. Rosa centifolia, Mr. Peterson said. The cabbage rose. Your favorite. You remember that? I remember everything about those days. He touched the tablet screen gently. When you and Richard were small. When your mother was alive. When this house was full of family. Marcus busied himself with his tools, feeling like an intruder. But Mr. Peterson waved him back. Stay, the old man said. You're part of this too now. Sarah cleared her throat. Dad, about the house. Richard's been reviewing the latest safety reports. He thinks, I know what Richard thinks. Mr. Peterson's voice hardened slightly. That I'm too old, too forgetful, too much of a risk. He's worried about you. We both are. Worry is not the same as caring. He gestured at the kitchen window. Look out there. See those people in the garden? They worry too. But they also show up. Every day. In person. Not through screens and sensors. Sarah flinched. Dad, I'm not angry anymore. He continued softer. I understand why you and Richard chose the lives you did. Why visiting became too hard. Why it was easier to manage me from afar. That's not, but understanding doesn't make it right. He straightened in his chair. This house, these people, they're my family now too. They've earned that right through actions, not blood. Marcus pretended to check wiring connections, avoiding Sarah's eyes through the screen. We're still your children, she said quietly. Yes, and I love you both. But love isn't enough without effort. Mr. Peterson touched the tablet again. These fancy systems, these daily check-ins, they are a start. But they're not enough either. Sarah wiped her eyes. What do you want from us, Dad? What I've always wanted. Time. Presence. Real connections. Not digital ones. He smiled slightly. Maybe start with dinner? When the house is finished. Yes. Of course. She looked past him to Marcus. Will you be there too? Marcus hesitated. He will, Mr. Peterson answered for him. Along with Mrs. Rodriguez, who's cooking. And the Garcias, who saved your mother's roses. And everyone else who helped rebuild more than just a house. Through the tablet, they heard Sarah take a shaky breath. Richard won't like it. Richard will adapt. Or he won't. That's his choice to make. Mrs. Garcia appeared at the back door. George, we're ready to move the big rose bush. The one Martha planted when Sarah was born. Mr. Peterson stood. Coming. To the tablet. I need to go help with your mother's roses. Think about dinner. Okay. I will. Sarah hesitated. Dad? I'm sorry. For not being there. I know. He smiled. Now do something about it. The tablet screen went dark. Mr. Peterson grabbed his garden gloves from the counter. Coming, Marcus? These old hands could use some young muscle. Outside, the garden was organized chaos. Mrs. Garcia directed operations like a general, her sons carefully digging around precious root systems. The roses would survive winter in the community greenhouse, tended by volunteers who remembered Martha Peterson's smile. Sarah's trying, Marcus said as they worked. Yes, Mr. Peterson gently freed a thorny branch. Sometimes trying is enough. Sometimes it's not. Time will tell. They worked through the morning, saving what they could. The security system tracked their movements, sending reassuring data to distant screens. But the real safety was here, in careful hands preserving memories, in shared labor building trust, in a community that understood the difference between monitoring and caring. By noon, the roses were safely transferred. Mrs. Garcia's sons cleaned up broken pots while their mother made notes about which plants went where. The greenhouse would be ready tomorrow. Your mother loved this garden, Mr. Peterson told Marcus as they watched the cleanup. Said it gave her peace during hard times. A place to remember without pain. Richard and Sarah never visited it. Did they? After she died? No. Too busy. Too far. Too many excuses. He pulled off his gloves. But maybe that can change. If they're willing to try. And if they are not. Mr. Peterson looked around, at the half-rebuilt house with its hidden safeguards, at Mrs. Garcia teaching her sons the names of roses, at the community that had become his safety net. Then I still have family, he said simply. Just not the kind I expected. Inside, the security system beeped its hourly check-in. Somewhere, screens showed green lights and stable readings. Somewhere, children too busy for visits were reassured by data. But here, in what remained of Martha's garden, real family did the harder work of showing up. The dinner table stretched the length of Mrs. Rodriguez's diner. 3 generations of Garcias crowded one end. Tony the electrician and his family filled the middle. Mr. Chen and his brother argued good-naturedly over plates of empanadas. Marcus's mother, fresh from her shift, still wore her nursing scrubs. And at the head of the table, George Peterson sat between his children. Richard looked uncomfortable in casual clothes, his suit and tie abandoned for the occasion. Sarah kept checking her phone until Mrs. Rodriguez quietly placed it in her purse behind the counter. "Time to eat," the diner owner announced, "not time for business." The food came in waves, dishes from every family present. Mrs. Garcia's tamales, Mr. Chen's dumplings, Mrs. Rodriguez's famous ropa vieja, enough to feed an army or a family that had chosen itself. "Try this, Richard." Mr. Peterson passed his son a plate. Mrs. Rodriguez's picadillo. "Your mother loved it." Richard accepted the dish awkwardly. "Mom came here every Sunday after church." Mr. Peterson smiled at the memory. "Said it was better than any fancy restaurant." "I didn't know that." "There's a lot you didn't know." But Mr. Peterson's voice held no anger now. "A lot you can still learn, if you want to." Sarah watched the interactions around the table, the easy conversations, the shared jokes, the natural flow of people who knew each other's stories. "They really do care about you," she said quietly. "They do." Mr. Peterson touched her hand. "And there's room for more caring, if you're interested." Marcus brought more water for the table, his burns now faded to pink scars. 2 months of healing, of rebuilding, of learning what family could mean. "House is ready," he reported. "Final inspection passed yesterday." Richard set down his fork. "All safety systems operational. Everything works." Marcus resisted rolling his eyes. "You can check the monitoring app yourself." "I have." "Hourly." "Richard," Sarah warned. "What?" "I'm concerned." "You're controlling," Mrs. Rodriguez called from the kitchen. "Different thing entirely." The table went quiet. Richard's face reddened. But Mr. Peterson laughed. "She's right, son. Always has been. Even your mother said so." "Dad." "No, listen. All of you." Mr. Peterson stood, addressing the crowded diner. "When I almost died in that fire, I thought I'd lost everything. My home, my memories, my connection to your mother." He gestured at the rebuilt house visible through the window. "But look what happened instead. I got a new home, safer than before. I got my neighbors, no, my family, working together to protect not just my life, but my dignity, my independence." Richard started to speak, but Sarah touched his arm. "And I got my children back," Mr. Peterson continued. "Maybe not the way I expected. Maybe not as often as I'd like. But you're here now, tonight, sharing a meal with the people who helped save more than just a house." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with dessert, bread pudding from Martha Peterson's recipe. "Found this in that box of papers we salvaged," she said. "Thought it was time." Mr. Peterson's eyes glistened. "She made it every Christmas." "I remember," Sarah said softly. "The whole house smelled like cinnamon." "Still does," Marcus added. "Mrs. Rodriguez has been practicing all week." The diner owner served the pudding with careful ceremony. "Not as good as Martha's, but it's perfect," Mr. Peterson said after one bite. "Exactly how she made it." Richard took a small portion, then a larger one. Something in his face softened. "Mom's recipe. The original." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "Found it in her garden club notebook. All her blue ribbon winners." "The notebook survived?" Sarah asked. "But the fireproof box in the garden shed," Marcus explained. "Mrs. Peterson told me about it last year. Said some things were too precious to risk. Like family," Mr. Peterson added quietly. Richard set down his spoon. "Dad, we should have been here." "Yes, you should have." Mr. Peterson's voice was gentle. "But you're here now. That's a start." Sarah wiped her eyes. "The roses, they survived the winter. Come see for yourself." Mr. Peterson stood. "They are blooming in the new garden. Your mother's favorites, the one she planted for each of you." The table watched as father and children walked to the door. Through the window, they saw the family move toward the rebuilt house, its fresh paint glowing in the evening light. "Think they'll stay?" Marcus asked his mother. For a while, she squeezed his hand, and maybe next time it won't take a fire to bring them home. In the new garden, Sarah knelt by a rose bush, touching familiar petals. Richard stood awkwardly until his father handed him gardening gloves. Martha always said dirt was good for the soul, Mr. Peterson told his son. Time to get your hands dirty. Inside the diner, life continued. Mrs. Rodriguez cleared plates. The Garcia boys arm wrestled over the last empanada. Mr. Chen argued with his brother about baseball scores. Marcus watched through the window as 3 generations of Petersons tended roses together. The security system would log their movements, send updates to distant phones and monitoring services. But the real safety was here, in shared meals and saved recipes, in blooming flowers and healing hearts, in a family that had chosen itself and grown stronger for it. Mrs. Rodriguez brought him more bread pudding. Your arms don't hurt anymore. Marcus touched the scars that would always remind him of that fiery night. Not much. Worth it. Yes, she agreed, watching the scene in the garden. Family usually is. The sun set over Cleveland, painting the rebuilt house in shades of gold. Inside and out, warranties guaranteed its safety. Monitors tracked its system, sensors guarded its rooms, but the real protection came from something no contract could provide, a community that understood the difference between watching and caring, between obligation and love, between blood and choice. In the garden, Mr. Peterson showed his children how to prune roses, just as their mother had once shown him. Sarah's phone stayed in Mrs. Rodriguez's purse, forgotten. Richard's tie remained loosened, his hands learning the feel of good earth. And Marcus sat in the diner surrounded by his chosen family, the scars on his arms a map of decisions made and lives changed, knowing that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't running into a burning building. Sometimes it was simply showing up, day after day, and choosing to stay.